welcome to the Narrowing Path, walking the spiritual walk. My name is Steve Van Iderson. Thank you for joining me again today for the daily reading from James Allen's Daily Meditations. I'm really looking forward to this. April's been opening up with a lot of really strong, really in-depth and important messages so far, and I have a feeling it's just going to continue to follow down those lines, and which is always exciting for me. So I'm looking forward to today's reading, and this will be fresh to you and fresh to me, meaning that you'll get my genuine response, reactions, observations, and what I relate to about the reading. And as this will be my first time reading it on the podcast with y'all. So thank y'all for joining me again. And here we go. This is April 4th reading of James Allen's Daily Meditations. Only the choosing of wise thoughts and necessarily the doing of wise deeds leads to wisdom. The multitudes, unenlightened concerning their spiritual nature, are the slaves of thought, but the sage is the master of thought. They follow blindly. He chooses intelligently. They obey the impulse of the moment, thinking of their immediate pleasure and happiness. He commands and subdues impulse, resting upon that which is permanently right. They, obeying blind impulse, violate the law of righteousness. He, conquering impulse, obeys the law of righteousness. The sage stands face to face with the facts of life. He knows the future of thought. He understands and obeys the law of his being. Thought determines character, conditions, and knowledge. Well, this is a great reading today. I love the entire theme of this, which is the before and after of becoming enlightened, of actually beginning to walk and live a spiritual way of life. We become aware of what we're actually doing, and we become aware of what is our motivating factors, and we become aware of what why we're doing things, and we start to aspire and become motivated to do things for a greater good than just selfish ends and selfish desires, and letting ourselves and letting our egos and letting our animalistic behaviors, and here in this reading he calls them the impulses of our lives and of our being, and being slaves to our thoughts and ran by them, and then switching over to being able to use our mind as a tool to be able to refine our thoughts, to guide our thoughts, to have our actions reflect reflect a spiritual way of living, rather than a animalistic or selfish or sensation or pleasure-filled life, right? Because those are two very different paths. One is serving self, and one is serving truth, and one is serving goodness or God or nature or whatever you would like to call it. So that's what we're talking about here, is we're getting that comparison. This is a comparison one, and I always like those, like I say, and because I need to be able to see some examples of the serving of the self, and I need to be able to see the opposite of serving the truth. So it'll give me, if I'm honest, if I can be honest with myself, a direction to take, or an understanding of where I am on that scale of things. And I think that's important. So let's go ahead and we'll read this, go through this one line by line. Excuse me. So, only the choosing of wise thoughts and necessarily doing of wise deeds leads to wisdom. I think that's what just struck me about that is it says it leads to wisdom. I was under the false impression that I could go out and talk to enough people or do this or do that or read enough books and I would be considered wise. I would have enough wisdom to feel comfortable to make the right decisions. And what he's saying here, we have to choose wise thoughts, so we have to change our thinking first. We have to have thoughts that are aligned with righteousness. And necessarily doing of wise deeds leads to wisdom. So we have to choose the thoughts and do the deeds that reflect the principles and the spiritual way of life that we're doing and put in the actual effort and work. And then the wisdom comes in the unfoldment and the reactions to our actions, or the results more so. I don't like to say reactions, the results from our actions. So wisdom is gathered that way. Wisdom is gained through the doing and the action of living a right and good life. Because I think a lot of people, based on fear, want to have all of the answers ahead of time. I know I do that. I still do that today. I don't like to, or I'd prefer to make a decision after I have every single piece of information that could possibly be available to me. But the reality of the situation is that's a fear-based way of thinking. And you can get paralyzed there and become a individual that is completely indecisive because we never feel like there's enough information. We're letting our reliance on self and our own belief that external things can give us a sense of safety and security, which just isn't true. So, you choose the thoughts, you do the deeds, and then those lead to wisdom. The main body of this starts, the multitudes, unenlightened concerning their spiritual nature. That's what the general population is. He's saying here is the mindset of the many is unenlightened concerning their spiritual nature, not even aware of it. So you can't even necessarily hold it against them when they're not aware of what drives them or the differences in the way of life that they can live. It's honestly more of a compassionate perspective we get to take because it's not, they aren't even aware to or in the know that why they're doing the things they're doing. And when someone's that ignorant, because we've talked about it on this podcast before, ignorance leads to a lot of the sin, a lot of the selfishness, and all of these things. So the multitudes unenlightened concerning their spiritual nature are slaves of thought, but the sage is the master of thought. So instead of us being the victims of our own thinking, right, which would really be the victims of our own fear, self-seeking, our self-delusion, our self-pity, right? Like when we are completely ran by the mind in the sense of being reactive to our thoughts, when we don't realize like the mind and the body are both tools for us, the individual, the soul, the spirit to use, we become slaves to the mind. And the mind isn't like, it doesn't have a tendency towards the positive, I'll tell you that much. That has to be trained into our minds. That has to be the perspective we take, right? So we become slaves of our thoughts, and that can be a pretty damaging place to be. It becomes a life running solely on selfish gains or selfish ends or a need for safety and comfort being demanded from the outside world. But the sage is the master of thought. When we can step back and understand our spiritual nature, and understand that we have a physical being, a mental being, and then a spiritual being. And the physical and the mental are the two, right and left hand of our spirituality, the tools to be used for it. We get to actually command those things. And that's a powerful place to be. I didn't know that was, I know for myself, I didn't realize that was this actual situation. He goes on to say, they follow blindly. He chooses intelligently, meaning the unenlightened just do and are reactive to every thought that they have and chase or run from every feeling or impulse. And the sage chooses intelligently. It chooses what is the right thing to do based on a spiritual living and spiritual principles, right? We have the ability to choose today the right thing or the wrong thing. So that is something I didn't know was possible either, the ability to choose what thoughts we listen to. And when we do that, we refine our thinking as well. They obey the impulse of the moments, thinking of their immediate pleasure and happiness. He commands and subdues impulse, resting upon that which is permanently right. So the unenlightened, the self-serving, choose things in the moments that will result in immediate gratification. That's a big term that's been used these days. Immediate pleasure and happiness is how he phrases it here. And that is the primary thing we consider when we're just serving ourselves. At the expense of anyone and anything around us, we will usually make decisions that harm for our own sense of happiness and satisfaction. But the sage, the wise person, wise one, the enlightened soul, commands and subdues impulse, resting upon that which is permanently right. Because after you do this for even the small amount of time, happiness results and contentment with life results, and you realize joy, freedom, and strength and power results from a life living on steadfast and grounded principles rather than immediate pleasure-seeking motives. And the fullness and the depth and weight of a life lived on spiritual basis is substantially more rewarding than any short-term pleasure that could be gained. They, obeying the blind impulse, violate the law of righteousness. He, conquering impulse, obeys the laws of righteousness. And those are the spiritual principles that we talk about here. Those are those spiritual leanings and those values that we get to base our decisions in life upon, which result in all of these character qualities that we didn't know were possible, and all of these freedoms we didn't know were possible. The ability to just be present in a moment. It's a pretty amazing thing. And that is what he's referring to here when he says the laws of righteousness. The sage stands face to face with the facts of life. He knows the nature of thought. He understands and obeys the law of being. Law of his being. There's a term that gets used in the 12-step recovery community that says ceased fighting anything and anyone. And I always interpreted that as I have to live in reality. I don't live in delusion. I live in the reality of the circumstances, the reality of the immediate situation, whether that's a person, a business, a external circumstance, whatever it could be, my personal health issue, whatever might be going on. Right? I look at it squarely in the face. I face the facts of life. And when I can do that, it gives me the ability to act and the freedom to act. And that's a place I didn't know was possible. I didn't even realize that's where that came from. I thought it was always like, well, what's best for me, but coming from a selfish and impulsive place. And sometimes it's doing the right thing. It's or all the time as living that righteous way of life, which is those spiritual principles, the honesty, faith, hope, courage, and integrity, willingness, forgiveness, all of these amazing things that we get to practice on a daily basis. The sage stands face to face with the facts of life. He knows the nature of thought. He understands and obeys the law of being. He knows that we are our thoughts. A man is the thoughts he thinks. That's where our character comes from, because that's where our deeds originate from, is our thoughts. All right? So the importance of choosing the thoughts we listen to and using our minds in a way that follows this righteous path that we're leading is extremely important. And the sage, the enlightened one, the wise one, knows the nature of thought, knows the importance of how that is. He understands and obeys the law of his being, his spiritual nature, and that our job is to that our purpose in life is to purify our heart, think good thoughts, and do good deeds, and live a righteous and just life, and good life, and seek goodness in all that we do. Which sounds, when you say it like that, might sound like a tall order, but when you really think about it, it's quite simple. Thank God. And it ends it with, thought determines character, conditions, and knowledge. So everything we have springs from our mind. Everything we are, for our character, about ourselves, the conditions we live in, and the things we know, and the perspectives we take, are determined by the thoughts that we entertain and that we have. And that's an important thing to remember. So, absolutely just brilliant reading today. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. I love these comparison ones. And it just reminds us of where we have to be and the direction we have to be taking. So thank y'all for joining me today, though. I really appreciate it. And I will be looking forward to April 5th. It's been a standout month so far, that's for sure. So thank y'all for jumping on with me today. And until next time, thanks.